The first sign that Moscow's ordinary Wednesday had become extraordinary was not a siren, a blast, or a flood of gunfire. It was silence. The constant, low-frequency rumble of the city's traffic, the heartbeat of over 13 million people, faded to almost nothing. On the Garden Ring Road, usually a river of cars and buses flowing incessantly, vehicles slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Iconic avenues, Tverskaya, Novy Arbat, Kutuzovsky Prospect, stood eerily empty. Some cars were abandoned mid-intersection, doors ajar, as if their occupants had vanished into the cold air. No holiday, no cordon, no warning. Just a city suddenly suspended in a state of near-perfect stillness. By mid-morning, the emptiness became undeniable. Citizens, accustomed to Moscow's unrelenting rhythm, were nowhere to be seen. The cause was revealed in a terse 57-second broadcast that aired on all state channels at exactly 5:47 a.m. It was not President Vladimir Putin who appeared, nor any civilian official. Instead, 5 men in dark military uniforms sat behind a plain table. At the center was General Andrei Serovikin, a figure known for his brutal campaigns in Syria, earning him the nickname General Armageddon. Flanking him were the commanders of the ground forces, aerospace forces, and the western and central military districts. Their faces were impassive, their demeanor precise. There was no ceremony, no anthem, no flags. Only authority. Serovikin read a short statement from a sheet of paper. The Council for the National Restoration of Order has assumed all executive and legislative authority in the Russian Federation. Civilian organs of power are hereby suspended. A curfew from 20 hours to 6 hours is in effect for Moscow, St. Petersburg, and all administrative capitals. The armed forces are in control. Citizens are urged to remain calm and attend to their duties. The broadcast ended abruptly, returning to a children's cartoon. No mention was made of Putin's status or the crisis that prompted this extraordinary takeover. In the absence of detail, fear became the default explanation. Rumors spread like wildfire. Messaging apps carried reports of confrontations within the Kremlin, small arms fire echoing through corridors, armored vehicles breaching gates. Other theories suggested a bloodless internal coup, with the military coercing Putin into resignation or detention. The state media's silence intensified the unease. Commentators vanished from social media. Television chairs remained empty. It was the quiet of power interrupted, and in that quiet, the city's inhabitants recognized danger. By the hour, the military presence became visible. Tactical units of the National Guard, historically loyal to the president, were replaced by regular army infantry, BTR 82A armored personnel carriers, and Tiger light armored vehicles. Soldiers, patches removed, established checkpoints at all major city access points, the MCAD ring, rail stations, and airports. Key buildings, the Central Bank, the Ministry of Finance, Moscow Exchange, and state media headquarters, were encircled with layers of troops and razor wire. The message was unmistakable. The military controlled movement, finance, and information. Moscow was emptying, and the world had taken notice. The silence in Moscow was not a lull, it was a signal. Within hours of the broadcast, the city's population shifted from shock to action. Residents, conditioned by decades of upheaval, instinctively recognized the danger. Tanks and armored vehicles on streets usually dominated by taxis and buses were not symbolic, they were warnings. Memories of August 1991 and October 1993, when elite conflict spilled into public view, returned in collective consciousness. The response was immediate. People fled. Supermarkets were emptied within hours. Shelves of pasta, canned goods, and bottled water disappeared, leaving frantic lines of shoppers. Citizens queued at ATMs, withdrawing physical cash from machines that still functioned, anticipating a collapse of digital systems. Vehicles became lifelines, even as roads clogged under the mass exodus. The M1 to Belarus, M10 to St. Petersburg, and M2 to Ukraine transformed into gridlocked corridors, engines off, horns silent, families packed into every available seat. The M4 highway to the Caucasus became a frozen river of metal and human determination. Railway stations, though officially closed, attracted thousands seeking trains. Crowds pressed against cordons of soldiers, desperate for passage that might never come. River terminals witnessed frantic efforts to secure any boat capable of moving down the Moskva River. Even those without cars or access to public transport walked along highway margins, hauling suitcases and belongings towards uncertain safety. The exodus was chaotic, yet it was guided by instinct. Moscow's inhabitants were voting with their feet for survival over politics. The abandoned streets told a story. Cars left running out of fuel were pushed to the shoulder. Children stared silently from back seats. Parents whispered instructions. Neighbors helped strangers navigate side streets. Social media, before blockades limited access, showed surreal images of luxury sedans beside dilapidated Ladas, families moving en masse through deserted boulevards. Survival had become a communal act, yet the coordination was unplanned, a spontaneous response to a city emptied of authority. The military's silent occupation amplified the exodus. Checkpoints were established at every entry and exit point, reinforced with armored personnel carriers and soldiers in full combat gear. The central bank, the Ministry of Finance, the Moscow City Exchange, and state media offices were secured with razor wire and perimeter troops. Control of movement, information, and finance was absolute. The sight of this unchallenged authority triggered a collective memory. When the state lost control, ordinary citizens had to take responsibility for themselves. Provincial towns braced for incoming refugees. Roads became choke points not just for vehicles but for resources, as stores and local authorities struggled to absorb the sudden influx. The exodus was not an act of protest. It was a pragmatic decision, a survival mechanism. Moscow's emptiness reflected a breakdown in the implicit social contract. The state's promise of security and order had been suspended, and citizens moved to secure their own. Even for the elite, wealth and influence offered no immediate protection. The same uncertainty that caused public panic gripped those previously insulated from risk. Families packed, vehicles stalled, and highways transformed into desperate arteries of escape. In a matter of hours, the Russian capital had become a city in flight, a ghostly mirror of its former self. As Moscow emptied, the military's presence became impossible to ignore. Tactical units moved with precision, replacing the National Guard, historically loyal to the president, with regular army infantry, armored personnel carriers, and light combat vehicles. Soldiers in full gear, their patches hastily removed, established checkpoints at every highway, rail station, and airport. Airports were closed, flights canceled, and terminals patrolled. Railways and river terminals were cordoned off. The message was clear. The military now controlled movement, finance, and communication. The central bank, Ministry of Finance, and Moscow Exchange were surrounded with layered troops and razor wire. State media headquarters at Ostankino and offices of major news agencies were garrisoned. The city was under siege, not from foreign invasion, but from its own armed forces. Power, information, and logistics had shifted decisively into military hands. The physical control of the city mirrored the psychological hold over its inhabitants. Fear, uncertainty, and pragmatism dictated behavior. Citizens complied, not out of loyalty, but survival instinct. The speed and thoroughness of the military takeover suggested months, if not years, of preparation. Within an hour, strategic locations across Moscow were secured. Armored vehicles swept intersections, patrolling broad avenues. Soldiers set up observation points, checkpoints, and roadblocks, controlling access to every major transportation hub. Their operations were methodical, rehearsed, and terrifying in their efficiency. The population, watching from abandoned windows or moving along the city's periphery, understood that resistance was meaningless. The implications were immediate. The Moscow exodus was not a protest. It was an instinctual retreat from a potential zone of conflict. Memories of past internal crises, violent elite conflicts spilling into public streets, drove citizens to flee. Families prioritized vehicles, fuel, food, and cash. Supermarkets and ATMs were stripped of resources. Highways out of the city froze under the weight of metal, human determination, and fear. Every action reinforced a single truth: the civilian state had lost control. Beyond the capital, the message reverberated through provincial Russia. Cities prepared for incoming refugees, authorities scrambled to manage resources and maintain order, yet the scale of movement overwhelmed local infrastructure. The military's control extended beyond physical dominance. It fractured communication networks, ensuring that the citizenry could not coordinate independent responses. Social media access was patchy. Rumors and speculation filled the void. Conflicting narratives spread through messaging apps, stairwells, and small communities, each more terrifying than the last. International observers noted the significance. Moscow, the political, financial, and symbolic heart of Russia, had been subdued without a single public clash. The demonstration of military authority was not aimed at foreign audiences, it was aimed at the Russian population itself. By seizing central nodes of finance, communication, and transport, the council signaled that civilian governance was no longer relevant. The lessons of August 1991 or October 1993 were clear. When the state falters, ordinary citizens and institutions act first to protect themselves. In the empty streets of Moscow, amidst tanks and armored vehicles, the reality crystallized. Authority had been redefined. The social contract between the state and its people had broken. Movement, communication, and commerce were no longer under civilian control. Survival became the singular priority. And for those watching Moscow's streets empty and barricades rise, the question was no longer political. It was existential. The military was not just present, it was dominant, decisive, and unchallenged. The military takeover of Moscow sent shockwaves far beyond Russia's borders. Within minutes of the broadcast, global markets reacted with panic. Off-exchange trading for the Russian ruble collapsed, bid prices evaporating as traders scrambled to assess the unprecedented situation. Brent crude oil prices surged sharply, reflecting the sudden uncertainty over Russian energy exports, while European natural gas futures jumped, recalling the volatility of the early weeks of the Ukraine war. The Moscow exchange, of course, did not open. International financial systems, heavily reliant on Russia's energy and resources, confronted a sudden vacuum at the center of a major supplier. The central bank, encircled by troops, was effectively immobilized. Domestic financial transactions froze. Digital banking apps showed balances but could not process payments, and the country slipped almost immediately toward a barter economy. ATMs were stripped of cash, leaving citizens scrambling for tangible assets. Major corporations, particularly those in resource extraction like Gazprom and Rosneft, faced impossible choices. Foreign assets were now politically risky, and executives, many of them oligarchs with personal ties to Putin, were suddenly vulnerable to the new military authority. The ruble's collapse meant that Russia's vital energy exports could only be traded for hard currency or gold, often at steep discounts. Global supply chains braced for disruption. Western governments quickly recognized the gravity of the situation. Intelligence services monitored unusual armored column movements, communications blackouts, and suspiciously quiet embassies in Moscow. Satellite imagery confirmed troop deployments and the closure of key infrastructure. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session in New York, but procedural chaos hampered immediate action. NATO held a virtual summit, elevating readiness levels to DEFCON 3, while emphasizing that no aggressive steps were being taken. Leaked G7 communications reflected fear and uncertainty. "We are looking into a black box of unimaginable consequences," one leader reportedly said. Another observed, "The man who commands the world's largest nuclear arsenal is missing, and those in control have not identified themselves." China responded cautiously, calling for stability and calm without endorsing or condemning the military council. Analysts noted that the People's Liberation Army placed its rocket forces on heightened alert, a defensive precaution rather than a threat. Globally, the crisis exposed dependence on Russian energy and grain, sparking immediate concerns over supply disruptions. Countries reliant on Russian exports from Europe to Africa faced imminent shortages and rising commodity prices. Markets reacted violently to the uncertainty, with energy traders, commodity investors, and governments alike forced to reassess risk. The broader geopolitical calculus shifted overnight. Ukraine and its Western backers faced a double-edged scenario. The collapse of central Russian authority presented both an opportunity and a threat. A disoriented Russian military might pause operations, allowing Ukraine to regain territory, yet a unified, ruthless command could escalate the war dramatically. Diplomatically, Western governments faced unprecedented challenges, negotiating with an anonymous military council controlling the world's largest nuclear arsenal. The status of the nuclear briefcase, designed for the legally constituted president, was unknown, creating a terrifying variable in the global security equation. In Moscow, the economic paralysis and mass exodus reinforced the perception that the military now held absolute authority. Supply chains, cash flows, and communication networks were paralyzed, while outside observers weighed the consequences of a sudden decapitation of the Russian state. Panic, uncertainty, and fear were no longer local, they were global. As the military consolidated control over Moscow, cracks across the rest of Russia began to widen. Cities and regions responded differently, reflecting historical, ethnic, and political fault lines that had long lain beneath the surface. In St. Petersburg, a city known for its liberal intelligentsia and European ties, small clusters of anti-coup protesters emerged along Nevsky Prospect. Their demonstrations were swiftly dispersed by army units using stun grenades and batons, leaving the citizens stunned and cautious. The message was clear. Resistance would be met with immediate force, and autonomy in action was limited. Industrial centers, too, felt the tremors of central authority collapsing. In Yekaterinburg, workers at a major tank factory reportedly walked off the job, refusing to comply with orders from the newly imposed military management. While these acts were localized, they symbolized the challenge of enforcing military authority across vast and diverse regions. Soldiers and officers faced the difficulty of maintaining order among populations whose allegiance had always been tied, at least nominally, to the central civilian government. The most volatile region, however, was the North Caucasus. In Chechnya, strongman Ramzan Kadyrov, whose loyalty was personal to Putin, declared in a fiery video address that his forces would defend the legitimate authority of the president. Kadyrov labeled the military council traitors and usurpers, warning that federal military units entering his territory would be treated as invaders. This marked the beginning of a potential civil conflict, with federal military units confronting regional militias whose loyalty was tied to the vanished head of state rather than the new regime. In other ethnic republics, the effects were subtler but equally significant. In Dagestan and Baratia, local leaders refused to recognize orders from Moscow, asserting increased autonomy as the central state faltered. Communities deeply affected by casualties in Ukraine saw an opportunity to assert authority locally. The exodus from Moscow and St. Petersburg added another layer of pressure, as displaced citizens overwhelmed provincial towns and strained already limited resources. Social networks, supply chains, and municipal governance faced immediate stress. Economic consequences compounded the social strain. The central bank and financial system were effectively frozen. Digital transactions ceased, and physical cash became scarce. Citizens relied on barter, informal markets, and local networks to secure essentials. Corporations struggled to function, with managers confronting worker unrest in critical sectors like energy, mining, and transportation. The seizure of assets by the military introduced fear among the oligarchs, who suddenly became potential targets in a system they once helped sustain. The collapse of monetary and trade systems directly impacted citizens' daily lives, amplifying social discontent. In cities under direct military control, order was maintained, but at the cost of freedom. Military checkpoints, curfews, and patrols became omnipresent. In areas where local authority resisted, standoffs, small skirmishes, and civil defiance became increasingly common. Ordinary citizens caught between competing powers were forced into precarious calculations for safety and survival. The central state had not only been decapitated, but fragmented, and Russia's vast social, economic, and ethnic complexities threatened to escalate local tensions into open conflict. The internal fissures highlighted a crucial reality. The military's control was tactical, not societal. While Moscow could be secured by force, loyalty across Russia remained uneven, with local actors asserting autonomy and testing the boundaries of the new authority. The stage was set for widespread social upheaval, a patchwork of obedience, defiance, and uncertainty that threatened to unravel the nation from within. While Moscow's streets emptied and regional fissures widened, the world's most immediate and chilling concern was Russia's nuclear arsenal. Nearly 6,000 warheads, once under the strict command of the president, were now effectively under the control of an opaque military hierarchy. The disappearance of Vladimir Putin, coupled with the sudden rise of the Council for the National Restoration of Order, created a terrifying uncertainty about who had operational control. Global leaders understood that a lapse, miscommunication, or unauthorized action could trigger catastrophic consequences. Western intelligence agencies worked frantically to map the new chain of command. Reports suggested that operational authority likely rested with the head of the Strategic Rocket Forces, General Sergei Karakai, a career officer with impeccable technical expertise, but no political profile. Analysts assumed his immediate priority was securing the arsenal, yet the broader risks of miscalculation remained acute. The secure hotline between Russian and U.S. strategic commands was dead, adding another layer of danger. Former Pentagon officials warned that the likelihood of a nuclear misstep during such a sudden transfer of authority was higher than at any moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Diplomatically, the situation was paralyzing. The United States, United Kingdom, and European Union faced a dilemma: negotiate with a faceless military council controlling a nuclear superpower, or refuse recognition and risk escalation. Joint statements from Western capitals declared the council illegitimate, while continuing to recognize previously appointed diplomatic representatives. But the practical effect was minimal. The real uncertainty was on the ground. Who could authorize launch codes and under what circumstances? NATO responded cautiously but decisively. Forces were placed on heightened alert, and rapid response units were deployed to Eastern Europe. Officials emphasized that these were purely defensive measures, intended to reassure allies and deter opportunistic aggression. Meanwhile, satellite imagery and intelligence reporting tracked unusual troop movements, tactical nuclear site activity, and military consolidation near strategic locations. Every observation carried high stakes as analysts tried to infer the Council's intentions. China's response was characteristically measured but watchful. Beijing emphasized stability and peaceful resolution without endorsing or condemning the military council. Behind closed doors, PLA units reportedly placed certain northern and border defenses on heightened readiness, reflecting a defensive posture rather than intent to exploit Russia's internal crisis. Globally, countries dependent on Russian grain and energy immediately assessed vulnerability. Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia faced the prospect of shortages and rationing, intensifying the ripple effects of Moscow's sudden decapitation. The psychological impact was as profound as the strategic. Markets, governments, and civilians alike recognized that the world was now navigating a period of maximum nuclear uncertainty. No precedent existed for a nuclear superpower undergoing a rapid internal coup while its chain of command remained partially unknown. Even nations far from Russia's borders felt the weight of potential escalation, from accidental launches to deliberate misuse. Emergency protocols were activated, hotlines restored where possible, and intelligence networks worked around the clock. Yet despite all efforts, the core question persisted: who truly commanded Russia's most destructive weapons? Meanwhile, Moscow itself remained eerily silent. Military checkpoints, armored patrols, and curfews reinforced the new hierarchy, but the lack of clarity at the top filtered down, creating a tense atmosphere both within the country and across the globe. The world watched, waiting for the first decisive move, knowing that any misstep could have consequences far beyond Russia's borders. By the third day, the contours of a fractured Russia were unmistakable. The Council for the National Restoration of Order had imposed absolute martial law, dissolving the State Duma and Federation Council, mobilizing the economy, and establishing military tribunals with authority to enforce summary justice. Curfews, checkpoints, and the visible presence of armored forces signaled a new reality. The Russian state no longer functioned as a civilian institution, but as a military apparatus focused entirely on survival and the war effort. Economic paralysis compounded the crisis, with the ruble effectively dead, barter systems resurfaced, and physical cash vanished within hours in cities like Novosibirsk and Vladivostok. The seizure of corporate assets created internal instability as workers resisted orders from military-appointed managers, particularly in energy and industrial sectors. Export channels froze, cutting off oil, gas, and coal supplies, and creating cascading effects in global markets. Domestic shortages intensified social pressure, while the flight of citizens from major cities overwhelmed provincial infrastructure. Ordinary Russians faced an impossible choice: comply, flee, or resist, each carrying risks that could be fatal. The social consequences were uneven but severe. In Chechnya, Kadyrov's forces declared a zone of loyalty to the vanished president, effectively seceding from the new military authority. In Dagestan, local women blockaded conscription offices, asserting control over their communities. Ethnic republics, historically sensitive to Moscow's directives, exploited the vacuum to assert greater autonomy. Small pockets of resistance in industrial cities and cultural centers tested military authority, revealing that control outside Moscow relied on fear rather than loyalty or legitimacy. Internationally, the vacuum of authority created both opportunity and peril. Ukraine faced a moment of potential advantage, but analysts cautioned that a ruthless, unified Russian military could escalate operations with brutal efficiency. NATO and Western allies maintained heightened readiness, while Europe faced energy rationing and commodity uncertainty. The status of Russia's nuclear arsenal remained the dominant concern, with operational control likely in the hands of military professionals whose intentions were clear, but whose oversight mechanisms were opaque. Every decision carried global stakes. Information warfare became a critical front. The military council controlled state media, broadcasting narratives of patriotic purification and vilifying oligarchs and opposition figures. Exiled committees attempted to maintain a voice, calling for resistance and international recognition, but they possessed no media or military leverage. Even the Russian Orthodox Church, a longtime supporter of the Putin regime, issued only vague appeals for peace and unity, withholding explicit support for the council. Society was being reshaped through propaganda, fear, and coercion, with little room for dissent. The collapse of the Putin system revealed structural vulnerabilities. A regime built around personal loyalty to a single figure proved fragile under the pressures of war, economic sanctions, and elite discontent. The military council's rise represented not reform, but a radical reorientation toward nationalist, totalitarian control. The question was no longer about Vladimir Putin, it was about whether the Russian Federation could survive as a unified entity or would fragment into competing centers of power, risking civil conflict or strategic miscalculation. The empty streets of Moscow were just the first symptom. Across the country, loyalty, infrastructure, and society were being tested under unprecedented pressure. The world watched anxiously, recognizing that the outcome would define not only Russia's future, but global security, economic stability, and the balance of nuclear power for decades to come. The unraveling of a nuclear superpower had begun, and its consequences were only starting to be understood.